Hey everyone, I'm so happy to now be back from my month-long channel break. I took some time to unwind, recharge the batteries, and get away from cults and coercive control for a little while. And I must say, I sure am happy I did. But while I was away, it was not a total break because I had some pre-scheduled interviews, and this podcast was one of them. As always, talking to Jon Atack is informative, educational, and entertaining, and I hope you'll agree. This show was published on Jon's channel during my hiatus, but the things we discussed are so relevant to everything on my channel too that I didn't want to pass up the opportunity to share it with my subscribers. And so I present my discussion with Jon about narcissism and predators. I hope you enjoy it and get as much out of our chat as I did.
Right. Well, hello, I'm Jon Atack, and I'm welcoming my dear friend, Chris Shelton. And Chris is actually, he's very kind, and it shows that we are the best of friends because he's recuperating after 7 years of banging his head against the screen, and has kindly, agreed to come on the Jon Atack show, because we were talking the other week, and we do actually have conversations that we don't record, which might be a mistake.
Yeah,
you never know.
Maybe we should do something different there. We have such interesting conversations.
And when we were talking the other week, brought up the topic of narcissism, and I probably got quite heated about it because it's something that's fascinated me for years, this idea of the narcissistic personality disorder and the way that people talk about it and things that are said. And so I wanted to rant about that. And Chris has kindly accepted the invitation to be ranted at.
Bring it.
And make some comment. Now, I'm going to use as my source book, Rethinking Narcissism, The Secret to Recognizing and Coping with Narcissists, which is by Dr. Craig Malkin, who is an associate of the Harvard Medical School. So that's pretty good.
Doesn't get any more top tier than that.
It doesn't get any more top tier than that. And I was quite surprised by this book. I've been reading about this idea of narcissism for years. And I'm well aware of its history, which we're going to talk about a little. And I just think it is such a wrong word for the condition that we are describing. I doubt that I'm going to be able to change the classification that the American Psychiatric Association has made. But the story of Narcissus is a Greek myth, and it's told of a young man who fell in love with his own reflection and apparently turned into a daffodil at some point, which we classify as the Narcissus.
Right.
And associated with his story is the story of Echo, which will become relevant in a few minutes. Echo has fallen in love with Narcissus, as others have. One young man has actually killed himself because Narcissus would not return his affections. Echo has been punished by the gods so that all she can do is repeat what other people have said. So she hangs around Narcissus, and Narcissus is going, God, I'm beautiful. And all Echo can do is go, God, I'm beautiful. And that's very sad. So that's Narcissus, somebody who is self-obsessed, somebody who is only looking at themselves. Now, the first person to bring this into psychology was Havelock Ellis, an English psychologist in the 19th century. And I think his definition was accurate and useful. His definition was somebody who masturbates all the time and doesn't want to have sex with other people.
Huh.
Now that fits in with my idea of the guy looking at himself all the time.
I mean, that is a fascinating take on it, only because that still survives in its current incarnation or understanding of narcissism. In that, I immediately thought of a movie called American Psycho.
Yeah,
it's based on that book by Bret Ellis, right? And Christian Bale famously in that movie, I think there are two scenes where he's having sex with prostitutes, but he's staring at himself in the mirror while he's doing it. And that was, there's no accident there. That was clearly planned shots. And so there that is reflected all the way in modern cinema.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Sigmund Freud, and anybody who knows me knows that I detest Sigmund Freud.
For a panoply of reasons.
For a panoply of reasons, and we'll maybe do something about that one day. People keep asking me to, but read Frederick Kreuser's Fraud, his book about Freud, or Feet of Clay by Anthony Storr. That was the first thing I read in the 80s about Freud. That, you know, I sort of started reading Freud because Ron Hubbard had claimed that he'd taken ideas from Freud before he claimed that all of the ideas were his own, which is, you can take your pick with Hubbard as to which you believe. One of them may be true. One of them isn't. But he referred to Freud and this teaching he had from Commander Thompson, which through research that Russell Miller and I did, we found that he'd spent 4 days with Commander Thompson. That was the whole. But if you can give a doctorate course in 6 weeks, you can probably learn everything about Freud in 4 days.
Especially if you're, what, 11 or 12 years old?
He was 12 years old, Jag. It's on a trip through the Panama Canal. And whatever.
And knowing what a studious person L. Ron Hubbard was, and how attentive he was to learning, especially at that age.
Yeah, I mean, the diaries that Scientology accidentally released to me through the Armstrong case, where you've got 2 handwritten diaries and then a retype of one of them where everything's improved, because that's what diaries are for. Yeah, he's a kid. He's 16. He's a kid who's, you know, not really paying that much attention to anything, you know, nor was I at the age of 16, other than girls and rock music. I liked them, and that was good.
Right.
But anyway, Freud gets hold of this idea of narcissism, and he changes it to somebody who loves themselves to the exclusion of all others. Then Erich Fromm comes along, and he spent a lifetime. I mean, he's unusual among Freudian analysts in that he was not a doctor of medicine. His doctorate was in social psychology. He studied at the Berlin Institute in, I think, 1929, somewhere around there. And he immediately started disagreeing with Freud, which didn't get him, you know, he was kicked out of the Frankfurt School for being disagreeable about the great Messiah Freud, you know. And by the end of his life...
I wish science did not, social and otherwise, did not trend that way, but groups of people and thinking, science is no exception, unfortunately, to faddish thinking.
Yeah, and we find it even in the hard sciences where, you know, geologists disagree with each other and they shun each other, or they become spiteful and malignant in their approach. It's bizarre. I mean, and I like the idea. I mean, I do very strictly separate soft and hard science, that the sciences of the human, anthropology, ethnology, ethology, sociology, clinical psychology, and I think social psychology verges on being provable in certain places. But even there, we have to be very careful about the experiments. When you come to physics and chemistry, you've got something a bit more rigorous. But even there, I like the idea that there are people who disagree, that there are people, you know, in mathematics, you've got 3 distinct schools in mathematics. Do numbers really exist? That's one of the questions. And some of them believe they do, and others believe they don't, that they're approximations, you know, and you get these foundational disputes. And that's great because it stimulates different thinking. You're not all stuck with, you know, the luminiferous ether holding the universe together.
Right.
But with the Freudians, there have been some really severe battles, which are very cultish. They're very kind of, you know, we don't talk to him anymore because he doesn't do this. Jeffrey Masson found this out when he worked in the Freud archive, and he dug out the papers on seduction theory, which is the idea that children are trying to sexually seduce adults. Now, Freud believed this, and there's a little note in the official biography by Ernest Jones, which is a letter from Freud saying, I had to drop it because it would have made my work unpopular. But he still believed, as many child molesters do, that children are trying to seduce them.
They have to project themselves into the kid.
What's called coy behavior by psychologists. And I've seen it, and I've talked with a paedophile about it to try and understand it better. And they've really got it wrong. That's my perception of being around lots of children. And Freud got it wrong. He didn't speak to his dad for 2 years because he was sure his dad must have abused him, because all parents abuse their children. This was one weird guy. He takes narcissism and he gives this definition of it. Somebody who's self-obsessed, loves only themselves, has no love for others. Fromm comes along, and as he's over the decades deconstructing Freud and pushing more and more of it away, he stayed with the dream idea to the very end. And I think that's absolute nonsense that, dreams are teaching us something. They're pretty much random. Occasionally there'll be some insight in them, but they're pretty much random.
Agreed.
That's my conclusion. So Fromm said, Freud's wrong about this. Narcissists are people who do not feel love. They don't know how to feel love. They don't love themselves. And in a book called The Heart of Man in 1965, he gives us pretty much the definition that is used for the narcissistic personality disorder, what he calls the malignant narcissist.
And that was a pretty radical departure definition and philosophically from what had come before. To say you only love yourself is love directed inward, but it's love.
Yeah.
Fromm is saying, oh yeah, no, it's just not there at all. This is a person who's incapable of that. That's almost two different worlds of description of what we're talking about.
Absolutely, and I'm glad that you see that, because many people, when I talk with them, don't seem to get that this is actually inverted the definition.
Yeah, very much.
And we're no longer talking about narcissism. We are talking about, when I left Scientology, as a young lad in 1983, one of my closest friends was
decades ago.
That's all those years ago. One of my close friends was a wonderful man called Mitch Ptsd, and he started riffing on Hubbard's Way to Happiness, which is a ridiculous little text, which we won't get into here. The way to happiness is not based upon murdering your family and friends. You can murder anybody else, so that'd be fine. So he wrote his own text, and I don't think he ever finished it, but he determined, and I think this was really insightful, that the state of clear in Scientology is actually smugness. He got it down to one word, that you get to a point where you are smug. And so he decided that you have the state of smug and the way to smugness.
That is legit funny. I mean, it's absolutely true. It is reductionist as hell. There's a lot more going on, but it is hilariously accurate too. So I'll give him that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I think in looking at what we're calling narcissism, that smugness may be the important criterion. Now, Craig Malkin, he tells us some narcissism is good, even vital, for us to lead happy, fulfilled, and productive lives. And I'm going, narcissism can be good. There's an interesting thought. He goes on, he starts talking about, in the following pages, you'll discover many other truths that challenge accepted wisdom. And I love it when people are smug enough to tell me that they're going to give me a basket full of truths. I think the basket is deplorable. He says that he himself was a child of a mother who was narcissistic. And he says, like many children narcissists, while growing up and through my teen years, I didn't allow myself to feel special at all. I was terrified of even trying. I shrank from compliments or dismissed them. No matter what I accomplished, it wasn't good enough. Now, this gives him his essential thesis, which is there's a spectrum. At one end, you have unhealthy narcissism. At the other end, you have egoism. which is why I thought I'd mention Echo.
Mm.
He is saying he's an echoist, doesn't like compliments, doesn't like people to celebrate his birthday, doesn't want to be looked at, doesn't want to be admired in any way. And he's saying that this is a consequence of having had an unhealthy narcissist as a mother. Then in the middle of his scale, and it is printed in this book, he has healthy narcissism. So you go from 0 to 10 or what have you, and at 5, you've got healthy narcissism. Then he explains what he means. Narcissism is feeling special. That's how he defines it. That's a complete definition. So you can feel too special, feel special enough, or not feel special.
And so what are we, the three bears here? I mean, this is a little bit
Goldilocks definitely comes into this. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is one, it's again, we're just reducing these ideas down to the most simplest of veneers. But also we're talking about entirely different concepts here. We've gone from self-love, can't love anybody else but self, to no love whatsoever, to feeling special on a spectrum. Well, sure, I can put any emotion or feeling on a spectrum, but I would never call feeling special the spectrum of narcissism.
No.
It's only a part of what we kind of understand, if we're kind of using Fromm's idea, sort of. But there's so many behavioral aspects to this that are not, these are explanations that sort of don't really encompass all the behaviors we assign to this thing called narcissism.
No.
So yeah, I can see why we're sort of flailing around in the dark here a little bit with this. You're bringing up very good points here.
And he goes on to suggest and strongly that he can cure the narcissistic personality disorder.
You invalidate a person hard enough, long enough, so that they don't feel special anymore, and I guess you've cured them, right? They have no ego anymore. You also don't have a human being with any more hopes or dreams, but hey, at least they're not a narcissist, right? Come on, man. What is this? Sorry, I just cut you off there. I was just a little outraged. Sorry, I won't do that again.
No, that's good. That's what I want.
Yeah.
I want feeling, Chris.
Yeah, we are a little all over the place with this, aren't we? This idea of what this is. I mean, I have tended to go with, my exposure to this and understanding of the concept has been pretty Fromm specific, right? That's how I've been thinking about it for a very long time, is it's somebody who, and I didn't use love, I said empathy or compassion for others. Although I've tended to really question myself on that concept after watching, studying coercive control and predatory behavior, because it's just not true that somebody, and it's, I'll definitely talk about this on your channel. I have to kind of maybe not talk about it on mine anymore, right? Is Trump, right? But he's just the most visible example. I mean, we could say a Boris Johnson as well, but I'm not as familiar with Boris in his personal life. But certainly Trump is capable of feeling affection in a certain direction. Now, that affection is clearly tempered by his mafia don-like obsession with loyalty. And that actually is the deciding factor on whether he throws any affection your way, is whether you are demonstrating loyalty or favoritism toward him. He'll give it right back. So, is that egoism? I wouldn't call it that. I'd say that it's an obsession with loyalty and probably a fear-based thing if I was going to have to assign a single emotion to it. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, and there is if we look at the simple-minded narcissist, let's say, who thinks about everything as simple-minded people do in terms of polarities, that if you are a member of the family of such a person, a smug, let's call them that for the moment, then you are an extension of them.
Yep, that's right.
And so therefore, when he said that he'd do Ivanka if he was not her dad, which was a very unseemly thing to say,
right?
Really quite bizarre. He his family become an extension of him. But one, as you say, having seen now so many interviews with people who were close to him during his presidency, who are not very happy anymore.
Exactly.
And have opened up about the way that his emotions would just flip. 1 minute you were accepted, you were part of the family, and the next minute you're out and you're gone. And he will then attack you, as he did with so many of his former officials afterwards, people he'd appointed who he then, no longer liked. I mean, I've used him as a case study. Today I had a conversation with an independent Scientologist, and I've been looking for a long time to find somebody really smart who's into this stuff who'll talk to me, because talking to Andy Nolch about it, proved to be rather deflating all in all.
Yeah, a little counterproductive trying to carry on that conversation.
Yeah, so, I wanted to find somebody smart who would challenge me and my disagreement about just about every aspect of Scientology and what it is. And he came to a point where he suggested that I had confirmation bias with regard to Donald Trump. And I said to him, well, here's the thing. I divide this up. There's prejudice. That's where you don't know about something, but it doesn't feel right. That's prejudice, prejudice before judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a form of bias, but I think of bias as the other form of bias, which is I know a lot about it and I have come to a decision. The decisions I've made about Scientology are in fact based upon 48 years of, oh dear, it's horrible, isn't it? 48 years of study and, putting together the first history of the subject, putting together the first realistic cosmology of the subject. There's not one in Scientology itself. Talking with hundreds and hundreds of former members. I could not be called prejudiced. My conclusions may be wrong, but it's a bias that's been reached through reason. And so I explained that before Trump was elected, I'd watched about 20 hours of documentary about him. And he was sort of, yeah, but you're watching things that are negative. And I said, no, many of the people were friends of Trump.
Right.
Who were interviewed in these documentaries. So I've seen all points of view.
Yep.
I just think that setting up 2 other casinos to compete with your existing casino is not good business sense. That could just be me, but they all went bankrupt. So sometimes we come to an opinion after study and after thinking about it. It doesn't mean we're going to be right necessarily,
No.
but there's more chance of it. And especially if we didn't.
And you always temper that bias with a willingness to continue to look, and the degree that you're open-minded about a thing. In other words, willing to accept new information, willing to change your mind based on that new information. That's how you counter your own or other people's biases, right? And an educated opinion on a thing, it's a tough thing for me to say that is a bias, although I get it. I mean, clearly it's going to curve or affect your views and even your perceptions of things. But that open-mindedness and that discipline of that is really where that good critical thinking element comes in. I got to comment on that.
It's true. Yeah, absolutely. It is true. Good critical thinking. And of course, I have no skin in the game because I don't live in America.
Right.
And I despise the Democrats and the Republicans equally.
I have come to do the same. I'm afraid. I used to, because you're sort of, when you're in a binary system like American politics, where it's a 2-party system all my life, any attempt at a third party has always been quashed very, very hard. In a similar way to how unions get quashed. I mean, they just come in there any means necessary to destroy it utterly. So we're stuck with this 2-party system, and as a result of that, most Americans are very, very stuck ideologically in having to choose one or the other, and they don't understand that you actually do have the option to say, yeah, actually they're both kind of fucked, and I'm actually just going to be independent. Although that has now grown as a result of all the divisions over the last, I'd say, 10 years. Having, the independents have really, really taken off here because of that problem.
Yeah, and I mean, there need to be 3 parties in any system.
At least.
And
Yes.
I mean, it's if you look at the places that have proportional representation, that you've got Italy at one end, which has had pretty much a new parliament for every year since 1946. They're, and Berlusconi was not really, the period where they didn't was really awful. Total crook, that man. Great friend of Putin, as of course is Trump. But at the other end, you've got Germany, which again, with an open system and all sorts of political parties, does seem to be a better place to live, a safer place to live.
I would definitely endorse that. Yeah.
So who knows? Right. Let me dip back into my lovely Craig Malkin book and see what else I've got.
Yeah.
I might just put a few tags in.
Do you have, by the way, on that one, as I brought up empathy and compassion and love, and I don't look at those things as total synonyms. I believe that they are separate concepts, right? Distinctly so.
Yeah, I do.
And I tend to think about these personalities, personality disorders they're difficult. We're really just trying to, I think, without, and by we, I mean, psychology. I don't feel like a spokesperson for psychology. I feel like somebody who has some education in psychology and can comment on it from that position, that we're trying in what I would consider to still be baby steps of this subject, to categorize or umbrella, behaviors. And I don't know that that's the best system to go about categorizing people, but we do have people, groups of people, we can group them into commonalities of behavior that we can observe and go, we don't like this. This is antisocial. This is harmful to people. When people act this way, bad things happen. Broken relationships, abusive homes, destroyed businesses. It's a pattern with this kind of personality, and I think we struggle an awful lot with that. Throwing these words around for this, but what we're really just trying to do is categorize behavior. More so than categorizing. We then make the unwarranted leap to try to figure out why that behavior exists. Well, what's driving that behavior? And we tend to look inwards to neuroscience and sociology, sociological factors, family factors, genetics. What is it, right? And I think the failure here is not recognizing that it is a multidisciplinary problem, because it's a multidisciplinary situation. It is not nature, it is not nurture, it's all of it. And it's a difficult thing to go there, because niche fields want to own the space, right? Psychology wants to own it, but sociology has something to do with it, but neuroscience has something to do with it. Well, actually, it's kind of partially explainable in all of those spheres, but together you get an actually more well-rounded and more accurate view of what it is you're trying to even describe, if you approach it from all those angles rather than trying to stick in one bucket. And that's the mistake I see people make in the field and outside of the field more often than I think anything else. And that's why I think we keep stepping on each other's feet and tripping over each other with this, rather than coming up with a way of categorizing this behavior more accurately. If I'm, that's how I look at the general problem of this and why it is such a problem.
I agree with you. I think it's become difficult because of over-specialization.
Yep.
Because of competition between fields. When I, left Scientology, I started reading sociology, social psychology, and I realized that quite often they were describing the same thing, but they had a whole different vocabulary for it.
Yep.
They don't talk to each other. And then, you have schools like the Situationists, Phil Zimbardo, who I respect as a genius, incredible man. But he is very much a situationist. And in the Lucifer Effect, he gets to the end of the book and he says, okay, I have proved that basically evil is conditioned. evil, we've seen so many cases here. I think I've shown that that's so. There isn't the evidence, but I believe it will be true for goodness as well. And I absolutely balked at that point and said, well, you've just told us, one of the stories you've told us is about Chip Frederick, the sergeant who was sent to prison for 8 years for showing the photographs of the Abu Ghraib torture, or for taking the photographs, being involved with that. Mm-hmm. And of course, Zim had been an expert witness on his behalf. So, he had intimate knowledge of the case. And of course, in describing that case, you have to talk about Joe Darby. Joe Darby was the guy who he asked his friends in Iraq, if anybody got photos of Iraq for me to take home? And he was given the disc with these on. And he said his first response when he realized what it was on was to throw it in the bin, because he knew that his life would be at risk if he shared it with anyone. And he decided he couldn't do that. So he shared it. Then Don Rumsfeld outed him. He named him publicly. So after that, he had a bodyguard of four people to stop his fellow Marines from killing him because he'd blown the whistle.
Yeah.
But Joe Darby was not
the loyalty factor showing up again.
Yeah, on Semper Fi. Yeah. But Joe Darby didn't make his decision in a group situation. He knew what the risks were. He knew he was risking his life.
Yep.
To do good, to do the right thing. So I've come to the conclusion that, sure, people can do the right thing because they've been bullied into it, because they've been threatened that they won't go to heaven or what have you. Mm-hmm. But I've come to the conclusion that there are people who think their way and decide to be good. Mm-hmm. And that where evil is largely, we talked about apaths, we were talking about Jane McGregor's idea of about 60% of the population just go with the flow, whoever's directing them. And that will tend to be the sociopath they will follow, because the sociopath is more Machiavellian and conniving than the empath. But so we get to this point where if looking at DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, 5th edition, which was 2012. And there was a tremendous argument at the time this was being put together, because people were saying, look, you are linking together behaviors, symptoms, affects, when we now know that some of these conditions are neurological. And shouldn't we wait until we understand the neuroscience? Well, that too has become problematic. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've seen it recently, but a meta-analysis of with depression has said serotonin is not necessarily involved in any way. And so the idea of selective serotonin reuptake inhibition that is behind Prozac and sertraline and all of these, venlafaxine, all of these drugs, may not be true at all. The reason they're working, and I've suspected this for a long time, because in 1991, because Scientology was so against Prozac, I started reading about it. In fact, I actually spoke with Eli Lilly at one point about the lawsuit that Scientology had against them. And I, for free, advised them to get the hell out of Dodge, because Scientology would keep going forever. I should have charged them $10,000 for that advice, because it certainly saved them more than that. But there was this paper that came out in about 91, I think, where neurogenesis had been found. New neurons were being made in the hippocampus. And there is also research that shows that clinically depressed people at post-mortem have a shrunken hippocampus. And the hippocampus it's relevant for memory recall. So it seemed to me that you could fit these things together, that in fact, nobody knows how, but the SSRIs are not, bless you, the SSRIs are not necessarily functioning on serotonin at all. What they're doing is forcing the generation of new cells, which for people who are clinically depressed, which is not the majority of people who are taking Prozac, they have reactive depression, they're unhappy. And doctors have been talked into giving them this drug, which I'm not sure is, well, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the 1980s here said 80% of prescriptions, sorry, in the 1990s, 80% of prescriptions for SSRIs were wrong. That general practitioners were just handing this stuff out, and they were giving it to people who were unhappy, not to people who had clinical depression, a quite different thing.
Right, which of course rubs right up against my problem with that, which is, as you just mentioned, general practitioners. You might as well go to your veterinarian to for as much specialization as they're going to understand about mental health and mental processes. So that was a real disservice foisted off on the American public, that general practitioners were given the right to prescribe SSRIs or mental health drugs. That itself, I think, was a layer that kind of gets glossed over often in this discussion, and it's not an unimportant fact. I'm serious when I say you might as well go to your vet, because that's the level of skill and expertise that your general practitioner has. In other words, none whatsoever when it comes to trying to deal with mental issues and understanding mental issues at a level of expertise to be able to test for, diagnose, and treat these problems. And it's not all social. There are issues, right? And we do know from the fact that it's not an insignificant percentage of people who do have favorable responses to SSRIs, that there's something going on there. Perhaps your explanation is the one. Perhaps there's other things. I'm not really sure what the neurobiology of this is, but I do know for a fact, because I live with it and I've experienced it myself, that when you are on the right meds for the condition that you have, it really does deal with the problem. Now, does it deal with the problem the way they think it does? That's been a question mark since day one of these drugs. And that leads right back to our admitted ignorance of what the hell's going on up here, right? There are still neurotransmitters we don't have names for. I mean, I wish people could understand the baby steps here, the fact that these fields are scientifically speaking, just barely over 100, 120, 130 years old. And that's nothing when it comes to development of ideas of this complexity, dealing with this thing, the most complicated machine we know of in the universe. So it's, so I think we also have an expectation, and I don't mean to say all this as some kind of like defense, I don't think it needs defense. I think it needs this pointed out that we are in infant stages here of just trying to understand what's going on. And it's kind of amazing that we've actually been able to produce some of the results we've been able to produce, given our ignorance, our gross ignorance of neurobiology, the neuroscience of it, and the social psychology melded with that. As we just went over, these fields don't even barely talk to each other. And so of course we see so many mistakes made, and are going to see many more as we try to figure this out. I only pipe up like this because I'm so hyper aware of the Scientology-like criticism that occurs of psychiatry and psychology because of these pitfalls and these mistakes that get made. You weren't perfect the entire time. Like, if you go into any science, I had to talk with physicists just 2 days ago, and they just would not shut up about, the same level of ignorance and stupidity and trying to figure things out, and errors in the data and errors in the interpretation of the data. And in physics, these hard sciences, these ones where it's all math. No, it's not, because there's people involved, right? And so because there's people involved, you're going to have all these layers of nonsense going on. So again, it might come across as apologia, but I really am just trying to point out the facts of the matter and the state of the field so that it's understood what we're criticizing. And my take on it is, we're criticizing the things that got wrong, but let's be super, super clear, at least from my point of view, that doesn't mean the entire field is a bunch of bumbling moron idiots or evil people who are trying to do the world in. And that's unfortunately a position in the world right now with psychiatry and psychology. And I always have to kind of push back against that a little bit. I know I'm bringing in something that you weren't really talking about, but
it's absolutely relevant.
Yeah. So,
and I agree with all of the foregoing. Cool. You know, I've reached the same conclusion that if we like, it's the smugness of some of the practitioners that is a problem.
That's right. That's right.
This pretense, and I'm with Hubbard that psychiatry in its development, and particularly the 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is an accurate depiction of a psychiatric institute. And the proof of that is that the guy who plays the head of the institute in the film is the head of the institute. Don't know if you knew that.
I did not know that.
That's his only acting role. And he felt passionately enough about it that he used his hospital to make that film. And, you know, Ken Kesey had worked in a psychiatric hospital to get those ideas.
Yep.
Electroconvulsive Therapy
book, by the way, as well as the movie. I've read it and seen it, and
yeah,
absolutely, it's inarguable, and there is no excuse. And I can't look back at any of that and justify it, rationalize it. I understand why it happened, but it doesn't make it right any more than I understand why concentration camps happened, but doesn't make it right. You know, there's no justification there. It's just it happened, and we have to understand it. We have to understand why it happened, so that never again, right?
Yeah,
you don't allow it again. And this goes back to the 20s with the electroshocking the pigs, where we got electroshock therapy from. That was a brainchild of a guy out of Italy. I mean,
Looney. His name was Looney.
That's it. That's right. So there's that, and then of course we go back to Freud and his, you know, nuttiness with, you know, with all the things, right? And we can go on, and so much projection, you know, so much, because sometimes you literally did have the inmates running the asylum. I mean, it was just that bad. And I can look back on it, and all I can say was, well, fuck, at least we had an asylum. But, you know, damn. So much learning has had to take place, and society itself had to actually become a bit more of a civil place itself for this field to actually become more humane. Because if you go back to, you know, just cultural values all the way back, you know, at turn of the century, 1900, this was a time period when toilet paper was relatively new and babies were raised on alcohol. I mean,
best thing for them.
Yeah, I mean, all kinds of just things that we would be shocked, appalled, rudely, you know, morally indignant about, that we just don't even think about, because we hyper focus on very specific things and don't, again, and this is a mental health issue problem, right? We don't look at the bigger picture, the bigger influencers. Why do people act the way they do? Well, because their culture demands it many, many times, you know. So there's a lot of factors at play here, which I just like to bring up to point out to people, not to make any of this barbarism or nonsense in psychiatry's history okay, you know.
Yeah, and you know, the history goes back. You know, the current Imperial War Museum in London is actually in the Bethlehem Hospital, Bedlam,
right?
And there, people would pay to go and watch the lunatics, and it was a kind of sport, like bear baiting or the other stupid, unbelievable things that people used to do.
Yep.
And I'm actually going to reveal something you may not know, and that our viewers may not know. And this is something that I worked out. Electroconvulsive therapy was brought about because this Italian doctor, and there was an American doctor who I think was called Rabbit. Very likely story. They, both of them, for a bit of fun, used to go to the abattoir, to the slaughterhouse. I don't know why. I don't know what kind of personality it is that goes along to slaughterhouse to watch the animals being killed, but that was how they got their jollies.
And they came up with the idea.
Yeah, because they saw animals convulsing when they'd been given a stunning shock.
Yep.
Now, that went back to insulin shock, because it had been found that it was believed epileptics are calmer after their fits. And so they used insulin shock. But before that, you had cold water therapy, where you'd be put in a kind of rubber blanket and dropped into freezing water, which would induce convulsion, the idea that you calm down. Now, most of the textbooks, the history books, stop at that point. It came from somebody had seen that convulsion makes you feel easier afterwards. The little missing bit of the puzzle in the 19th century, and Freud had one of these, Freud used one of these on his patients. They had this condition that they called hysteria, from hysteros, meaning the womb, the woman's condition. When women got hysterical, they would go to a doctor, an alienist, perhaps, psychiatrist as they came to be known, and he would apply a machine to their clitoris to get them to convulse.
Yeah.
So there is the origin of a type of psychotherapy that has crept into our own time. Now, thankfully, ECT is not much used. It is still used in the treatment of severe clinical depression, but now there's both ketamine coma, which is used in Germany, which seems to be successful, and now there are brain implants which seem to be able to stop this particular brain activity that leads to severe depression.
Right.
So, I just said something naughty.
I'm just going to say straight up, it has never made sense. And within my knowledge of neuroscience and neurobiology, which is, again, very, very small compared to, what it could or should be. But it has not, and I don't see it ever making sense that randomly sending electrical impulses into a person's brain is somehow going to shock them into a more anything more than a more vegetative state. I just can't see it. And I'm told that with the state of science as it is now, it is pretty much a Hail Mary sort of situation if they are suggesting it. They have given up on anything else working. And that it really is sort of a last resort. And at that point, horseback riding might be as useful to you as going and getting. I mean, I don't know. I know some people have actually stated that they benefited from it, but I look at it as a Hail Mary. That's how I see it.
Yeah, there may be cases, it's like somebody tells me that they had tremendous gains from Scientology and it changed their life and they didn't commit suicide and this, that, and the other. That's absolutely okay by me. In their case, that worked. But talking to this guy today, and he was talking about Scientology curing PTSD, and I had to say to him, I've seen it induce PTSD in many cases. I've not seen it cure it yet.
Nope. One.
But that's my experience, and somebody else's experience is theirs, and it's valid. But I think you make a very important point that, as you know, I'm a big fan of Robert A. Burton. I even wrote to him to tell him I was a big fan, and he said thank you, which is nice. And he wrote this. He was the head of neurology at Mount Sinai, which is the University of California in San Francisco. And this is one of his books, A Skeptic's Guide to the Mind. So this is neuroscience.
That book. Loved that book.
Yeah. And he's saying, I think we're getting a bit smug.
Exactly.
So one of the things he points out, and I thought this was fascinating, he's saying, we don't know what glial cells do. The word glial comes from glue. The presumption has always been that they glue the brain together, and half of the cells in the brain are glial cells, the other half are neurons. It could be that the glial cells are doing a bit more than we think.
Yep. That's right.
So we are, there are 200 brain regions. It's said there's not one neurologist in the world who can name them all. That's how severe the problem is.
Well, it's akin to and people might understand this if we put it this way. I don't know. It's akin to the microprocessor problem or the computer problem. Up until the 1970s, you could theoretically be the guy who understood every part of the computer. You really did get the whole thing. You could build it from scratch. You understood how the microprocessor worked, how the boards worked, how the monitor and the various input devices worked, right? And
semiconductors.
Yeah, I mean, you could actually literally look at a board and understand what it's doing, or figure it out. And sometime around the 70s, certainly by the 80s, that became a thing of the past. You had to start specializing because the complexity of the devices simply became too much, right? I think this might be similar to what's that old story about the guy who it goes back to the 1400s or something, 14 or 1500. The guys who thought they were gonna know everything there was to know, like there was a point in time when you could have all the knowledge, and then and there's just too much. There's just way too much, and this is without question. I mean, nothing else even comes close to the complexity of what exists in the skull of every single human being. We've all got one, and no one understands it really.
And most people don't know what to do with it.
Right. There is that problem as well.
And somebody calls you a fathead. It's true. Your brain is largely made of fat. What am I going to say?
That's right. But anyway, I kind of completely derailed us there onto the psychiatry stuff, but it's just when we talk about the state of these things, and why it is that we have these terms, and I mean, I'm so sick of the term narcissist now. It's entered the public lexicon, unfortunately, in such a way that it's now watered down to mean basically whatever somebody wants it to mean. In that sense, in the way that people actually use the word, is this now this word for somebody who's just kind of full of themselves, or somebody you don't like, or somebody who was selfish in a moment, and you perceive it or interpret it as, oh, they're always that way, and they're pathologically that way, and so therefore, or they yelled at me once, and so therefore they tried to gaslight me. I mean, these terms they just become useless after a while, and that's the constant problem of specialist lingo ending up in in the common vernacular is a vulgar Latin, as I guess we could.
Yeah, dog Latin. So the word depression. I was feeling depressed. No, you weren't. You were unhappy.
That's right.
The word schizophrenic, which means something quite different to a psychiatrist. The popular meaning of it is multiple personality, which is not the problem at all. They're people who hear voices and see things that aren't there, but they don't have multiple personalities.
That's right.
That's just become part of the thing. Or the word paranoia, which has come to mean, anything anxiety is now paranoia, and on and on and on.
That's right.
And to look at this very problem of how accurate we can be, if we look at DSM-5, again, there we have the narcissistic personality disorder, and there are 3 clusters, and these are not Scientology clusters here, or nut clusters, as I like to think of them. You have cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C as definitions with, it comes down to this simple thing. NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is a cluster B, and it sits in there with the histrionic disorder, the borderline personality disorder, and bipolar. Now, the disorders are called disorders because you're meant to be able to resolve them with therapy. And the illnesses or psychoses, like bipolar, are things that require chemical treatment and may or may not resolve. That's if I've understood the simple distinction. The problem is cluster A, cluster B, cluster C. What's being said is there are 3 symptom sets. That's it. There are 3. And in cluster B, you will find the same symptoms presenting for somebody who is a borderline, for somebody who has bipolar disorder, for somebody who has the less often talked about histrionic personality disorder. And my thing with all of this is like, if you've got 7 of these 19 things, then you can be labeled this way. I say, why don't we just look at the 7 things you've got and see what we can do about that? What's the etiology of them? Where did they come from? Can we do something? Rather than classifying you in some brutal way as having this type of personality, Robert Hare in the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, which is an instrument used around the English-speaking world and probably elsewhere, I'm fascinated by his work. He's a brilliant man, but he changed his mind about the meaning of the word sociopath and psychopath. In his original text in the early 90s, he says that psychopath is a term for those of us who believe that this is an innate problem. You're born with it. Sociopath is a term for somebody who thinks it happens because of your nurture, your conditioning. And that's where the terms seem to have come from. He then says, okay, if you score from 0 to 4 on my checklist, you're normal, whatever that is. If you score neurotypical, what the hell is neurotypical? If you score from 4 to 30, you're a sociopath. And if you score from 30 to 40, you're a psychopath. So when you start looking at the cultural weighting of the questions, now, Scott Malkin comes to this point as well. He quotes all sorts of research on the narcissistic personality, all sorts of statistics. And then we get to this peculiar passage where he says, I and my colleagues, Dr. Stuart Quirk, Professor of Psychology, and doctoral candidate Shannon Martin, created a new assessment tool called the Narcissism Spectrum Scale. See how special you feel. And so he basically doesn't say, of course, all the things I've said about narcissism before come from tests that I don't rate. I don't believe in those tests. So rather than saying all of the research up until our new scale is actually invalid, he nonetheless accepts it, which I thought was interesting. And you actually do get a little, you can probably find it online, the Narcissism Test. You can do it on yourself and see how special you feel.
And just on that note, by the way, that's exactly how it's defined. I mean, just look it up here: narcissistic personality disorder, a preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love, a belief that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high status people or institutions, a need, and then summarize a need for excessive admiration.
Need for excessive admiration. And there we have it, the need for adulation, without which the narcissist, so-called narcissist, collapses.
Correct.
The amount of people I talked with about Ron Hubbard over the years, from 1950 right on through to the end of his life, where Sarge Fouth talks about it, he basically would break down if he was not adulated. John McMaster told me on several occasions that Tubby, I think he was calling him, had been in tears because John was so loved and he wasn't. John didn't deserve to be loved, but that's another question altogether. I got to know him a bit too well. Here is the narcissism spectrum. I'm sure Spike will have inserted it somewhere just to show that I speak sooth. At one end, it's got 0, abstinence, 3, habit, 5, moderation, 8, habit, and 10, addiction. I don't know what any of those things mean. So I'm going to move on swiftly. But you're an echoist or a, whatever from there. Where have we? Recent studies indicate that the bleak, once a narcissist, always a narcissist view doesn't necessarily hold true. If narcissists are approached in a gentler way, many seem to soften emotionally. When they feel secure love, they become more loving and more committed in return. And I'm afraid I've written the cynical comment in there that recent studies, which instrument to measure narcissism have they used? Have they used the Malkin one or the one that doesn't work? Because I would suggest, as his is quite recent at this time.
I'm seeing here that there's also broken down into 4 different types of NPD.
Yep. Let's hear them.
Grandiose, malignant, covert, and communal. And interestingly, it gives examples for 3 of those. I mean, grandiose narcissism is I'm better than you and I know it. Malignant narcissism is I will do whatever it takes to get what I want. Covert narcissist is I'm a great artist, but the world never noticed my talent. And then I'm not sure what the communal narcissist is. But to me, frankly, each statement follows one to the next. So I'm a little confused as to how these are 4 different types when I'm looking at this and going, well, I think each of these is an aspect of this personality that I've seen and talked with and interacted with and been punished by. So I'm a little bit like, I don't know that there's 4 different types here. That I question that valuation.
Yeah, and what happens if you happen to be Rembrandt van Rijn and have discovered a painting technique that nobody else has ever been able to equal? His letters from his teens onwards say he's the greatest painter in the world. Is he a grandiose narcissist?
Right. Exactly.
Or it was accurate.
So better than everybody else, and he just knows it.
Yeah. And it'd be sickening to sit around and have dinner with him, but having seen all of his self-portraits, they were all gathered in a show. I'm a painter. I was just completely blown away. What are you going to say? He's not somebody I'd want to know necessarily, but he was right. He had, Da Vinci, if he'd come out, Titian, if he'd come out, Van Eyck, there are so many of them. They were geniuses. So would they have healthy narcissism if they felt they were a bit special because they'd done something unique? Would Einstein be allowed? Was he a grandiose narcissist? So if we dig into it, there's this thing, and I think we've talked about this before, but I noticed this number kept occurring. It first occurs in Schopenhauer in the mid-19th century, and he basically says 60% of human beings are not human. Something like that they're peasants, they're not worth thinking about. He was a brutal man.
Damn, that's a harsh way of putting that.
Yeah, so something, in that sort of way. Then you get to Erich Fromm, who was 1941 escaped from freedom, when he's talking about Nazism and how it developed and how he had to escape from it, being a Jewish Freudian communist, had nothing going for him. And he says that he believes that about 60% of people, there's this number again, do not develop a self. They have a pseudo self, and so they just follow. They try and keep up with the Joneses. They try and do what you're meant to do. They try and have as good or better car as the people next door and wear the right clothes and all of that. So that was an interesting thought to me, because as he came up with the term malignant narcissist, I think what he's telling us is that 60% of the population are benign narcissists. And his idea that they don't feel confident in themselves, they haven't matured, they haven't become a self. I'm not sure, personally, I'd say it was somewhere after the age of 60 that I started to do that, but it always feels like it was just last week, oh yeah, I was stupid until last week, but now I'm clever as clever, and then I'm not. Then, of course, we come to Milgram and the 63 experiments at Yale. 62.5% of people are willing to go all the way to shock somebody totally.
Because, and then and let's be clear, because they're in a situation, going back to Zimbardo for a second, where they are an authority figure that they have recognized and agree is an authority figure is literally ordering them to do it, and they feel powerless to push back for whatever reason. They are not push back.
Milgram didn't. He did, I believe, 17 sets of experiments.
Mm-hmm. This is repeated all over the world many times in many different contexts.
And he dropped the authority aspects of it piece by piece, so it was no longer associated with Yale University. Mm-hmm. It was just something out there. The white coats went away. They put the actor who was screaming into the room with the person.
Mm-hmm. And these changed the percentages.
Yeah, the percentages went down a little bit, but bearing in mind that
I understood it from my readings that it was a significant change.
I've got his book here somewhere.
I cannot argue any of the figures. I did not memorize them in reading these.
No, of course not. They did go down. How significant we might believe they are. 100% of people were willing to shock somebody.
Yeah,
that was the starting.
That was the starting point.
But and the psychiatrist he'd asked about it.
I was just fascinated by it because I remember noting at the time and sort of bookmarking in my mind that as you remove the trappings of authority, the compliance rate went noticeably down. It wasn't a half a percentage point or something. It was
it's more than several percentage points. But this is the book, Obedience to Authority. But it's a long time since I read it. It's
Right.
2008. I read it. So
regardless, the point being that it's not an aberration of human thinking that we obey authority figures. It's built into us to do it. So it's not a deviation from a norm to follow orders. And if you have the trappings of authority built into a situation, the compliance rate goes up because of that factor, because of that basic factor we have, right? We are a leader follower species, as far as I can tell. We line up. We do. We don't have to think about it. We do it. And there are leaders and there are followers. And that is it. That's when I say we don't have to think about it, I mean, that's what I mean when I say, that this is instinctive kind of behavior, but you can mess with it. And you with it significantly, right? With these various trappings and situations. And that's what all these social experiments are all about. But they need to be understood against a base of understanding that we are a leader follower species. That's built into us to have, that hierarchy of authority. And I don't think that socialization that creates that. I think it's instinctive. That's my opinion, but I'll put that there as a baseline, right?
Yeah, I mean, I found the relevant thing, and you're absolutely right. The first experiment, in fact, he says percentage of obedient subjects 65%, and by the fourth experiment, it's down to 30%.
There you go.
Now, that of course argues against the idea that it's instinctive and inbuilt.
Oh, no. Because the recognition of the authority comes down.
Well, he says that the change in the experiments is the proximity of the person screaming.
Yep. Oh, okay.
How close they are physically. So the authority relationship hasn't changed, but rather than being behind glass, the person's next to them.
That's the other factor. That's the thing that pushes back against this hierarchy. Is our empathy factor.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually glad you brought that up, because that's the other part of it is we do have this follow the leader mentality that we'll fall into. Again, Zimbardo also gets into this pretty heavily, but that is weighted by, that is mediated by, right, or modified by that empathy factor, that compassion factor, right? Is that you don't want to do harm when the consequences of your actions are right in front of your face and you cannot deny them. It is way easier for us to engage in the what did Hannah Arendt say, right? The not the indifference of evil, but the banality of evil, right?
Banality of evil.
Yeah, is the distance. When it's farther away from you, when it's just pushing a button, when it's a drone, versus you have to point the gun at a guy and shoot him. And we saw this with police forces in Nazi Germany. Ordinary, what was that? Ordinary Men, the book, right? Christopher Browning's book on the police forces in World War II, who were made to go kill pregnant women and such. And compliance was kind of high, a lot of trappings of authority, but there were people who went, I'm not doing that. No fucking way. And there's no amount of orders you can give me that are going to change my mind on that,
There's a story in Brian Dye's and Victoria's Zen at War, which is, I think, a must-read, a remarkable book, because it's a Zen priest dissing Zen. And one of the stories he gets is, because the Japanese military were all trained in mindfulness, as it's now called, and Jon Kabat-Zinn tells us that all you need to do is practice mindfulness and you'll become compassionate. Well, the whole Japanese military and the whole industrial force were trained in mindfulness. It's called Zazen in Japan, but it's the same thing. And the same technique, exactly, the breathing technique, the way you sit, all of it. And one of the exercises that Japanese troops were exposed to was that Chinese civilians would be tied to trees, and the young soldiers would be told to charge them and bayonet them to death. And there's a story of one man who refused. And he was really surprised that he wasn't disciplined. And he said there was one other man in their company who wouldn't do it. But the thought was that the other 90 or so people were willing to murder.
That's what Christopher Browning wrote about, is there were these exceptions, but by far, ordinary people, policemen from districts in Germany where their job was to be a policeman, were brought shipped over to Poland and Germany, were made to do the executions, mass executions, and the tragic reality is most of them went along with it. You know, and so those exceptions do exist, but the rule seems to be follow the leader. You know, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not because we're evil little gremlins deep inside. It's a lot more multi-layered than that, but it seems to be the truth that is where we go.
Yeah, it may be a truth. When I left Scientology, I wasn't going to go and look at psychology because psychology is evil, right? And so I actually looked at zoology. And I read Eugene Morais's incredible books about the soul of the ape and the soul of the white ant, which are the first books of evidence-based zoology back at the beginning of the 20th century. He studied a troop of baboons for 2 years, and they were very friendly because the Boers had all had their guns taken away. So the young baboons had never been shot at. So they were willing to get close to humans. So he could study them. He studied termites, which are not in fact ants, but calls them white ants. And he came to some amazing conclusions. And in looking at those conclusions, where he was talking about something as simple as an ant and something as complex as a baboon, that there were aspects of behavior that you could look at in terms of human beings. I read a fair amount about chimpanzees, about bonobos, and started thinking about our behavior in those terms. And it's maybe the idea of leader-follower. We are social animals. So unlike, say, the tiger, where the male is so antisocial it'll eat its own young, you know, they get hungry, you know, need a snack. We don't have that going on in us, but we have a range of behavior which probably covers the entire animal kingdom from the amoeba on up. We are capable of behaving in just about any way. I think some people, I started thinking about the idea of the rogue. You get it among elephants, that other elephants won't have anything to do with them. And that seemed to me that was maybe the psychopath, that maybe that 2% of human beings are meant to be psychopaths, 3% of men, 1% of women. Women score higher on the borderline, though, if they thought they were going to get away with anything there. That this small proportion were rogues. They didn't have a social conscience. They didn't have this positive, pro-social way of being.
And that's where I think the possibility, or at least the theory of a genetic mutation or some kind of, you know, nature style thing going on there has some legs.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of put that
Keel's work.
And what's up with that, right? Especially also given that it's a significantly smaller percentage. We're not talking about 20% of the population. We're talking about, you know, maybe 2%. You know, I mean, those are, to me, that's encouraging, but it also, the way I think about things is a push in the direction of perhaps this is, I don't want to call it mutant behavior, but certainly genetically abnormal behavior, right? Because by far, I mean, any of us know, anybody who's gone to kindergarten knows that socialization is definitely where we're at. And we line up into hierarchies right away based on all kinds of values. You know, it tends to be might is right at our younger ages, right? Which is why we have bullies. I mean, it's just a developmental process. We're never going to not have bullies. But there is a point where bullies, you know, where the rational mind can take over. And we certainly need to continue encouraging that behavior. But then the values of what determines the hierarchy change as we become more complicated in our thinking. fashion, economics, geographical location, right? Where you live, where you come from, what language you speak. These are the things that we start lining up on. But we're always lining up on something.
Well, let me throw in a spanner into these works.
Yeah, yeah.
I, for periods of time, home educated all four of my children, and I became very interested in home education, what school was for, and what was going on. And one of the little tidbits that came out of studying home education was that home educated children do not necessarily fall into hierarchical position when if they go to university or they join another group. So I do think that school is a lot to blame for, labeling kids as being something and putting them into a hierarchy. And at the same time,
I'll argue the purpose of school is to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's to create obedience, to create an authoritarian structure, which is the most utterly unnecessary and stupid thing to do. Because vain as Rembrandt and Da Vinci may have been, we want people like that, please. We don't want standardized, uniform people. We want people who can creatively give something to society rather than have to put their hand up when they want to go to the toilet,
Very much so. It begs the question, though, given what we were also talking about, whether everybody is actually on a level playing field to be able to achieve that potential.
No, we want something that will allow people to achieve their potential. I mean, in this school, in this country, in the last 10 or 15 years, the thought has been to close all the special schools for people who have learning difficulties, disabilities, and put those kids into the ordinary classroom and put a learning assistant with them. And, I had a very interesting school experience. I went to a top school, which was the top school in the county, where they accepted oiks like me. And, some of the kids were actually, money was being paid for them to go to this school. It's the same school that Samuel Johnson went to, Dr. Samuel Johnson. And I had the same teachers. And I was very pleased to find out that he dropped out of the school too, and that his doctorate only came when he refused to publish his dictionary unless he was given a doctorate. So bless the man. But and the school had already existed for a couple of hundred years when he went to it, and probably had the same teachers then as well. So this is a very highly regarded school. It would send 3 or 4 people to Oxbridge every year. And I went from that into because I walked out at 14, the headmaster was rude about my mum because of an excuse note she'd written, which was entirely true. I had spent the afternoon at home because her lunch guest had been late, and he called her a liar and a cheat. And at age 14, and more frightened of this man than anybody, he was enormous and he had flogged me with a cane. But I just looked at him and said, until you withdraw that comment, I'm not coming back to school. And nobody knew what to do. So I got 11 weeks holiday. I went and saw Jimi Hendrix and The Who. It was brilliant. Santana, Chicago, Moody Blues, you name it, Pink Floyd. The Doors, I even saw the Doors. And then I went back to school at 15 in the lowest of the schools in the area, which was much bigger. And there, to my interest, you were really streamed according to every subject. So you have 5 different streams according to your ability, and you go into a stream with kids who are of a similar ability. And I'd never thought about that. We were just streamed into, the clever kids and the kids like me, and who weren't so clever, or science or modern, where you did languages. But here it was like, if you were good at maths, you're in the top stream. If you're having a hard time, you're in the bottom stream, and you could get the help you needed, which I think is probably a good thing. But I do worry about institutionalization. I worry about, I think we should have smaller schools, smaller hospitals, more, not these great cities of hospitals that we now have, which spread germs crazily all around. I have a house guest who studied medicine, and she was saying the curtains that they have around the beds, they're filthy. They've finally brought in a system where they're dated and they will actually wash them and stuff like that. But the consultants' ties, absolutely bug-ridden. So you've got Mercer and all of these dreadful things happening.
Interesting.
So,
I will say, I'll just pipe in real fast to say I agree with you. I do believe that we have. It tends to be an either or argument, and I don't think it should be. Right? I think that we have. I think we have this hierarchical structural instinct, right? Because we just do. But then we also reinforce that in the school system because they are about making compliance robots rather than about education, right? In the same way that prisons are more about eye for an eye punishment, kind of biblical judgment, more so than they are about rehabilitation. Certainly, I can say that in the United States, right? There are other places in the world that are getting this better. But they're only getting it better as a result of a lot of research and a lot of work by very smart people who are literally trying to reframe the entire argument of what are we doing with our criminal element? And the United States hasn't really barely caught up with that or those arguments at all. So so you have institutional level problems and you have institutional level purposing that is not necessarily what we all like to think it is. And that's its own level of problem. But I think that these institutions are not the things that create hierarchical problems or social issues. That's us. We're doing that. And again, even in a prison system, you have an enforced structure, but even then, look what happens. Groupings, factions, and hierarchies. They just naturally form, right?
yeah.
And that's my argument, really, is that we're gonna do that whether we're told to do that or not, right? In any group situation, that's going to happen. But it doesn't, that's not the good and bad thing. It's not a value judgment thing. It's just what we do. It's kind of like anywhere you go, if you want to stay alive, you're going to have to eat. It's not a good or bad thing. It's just a fact. You know, you got to eat.
Oh, eating's a good thing, definitely.
Right.
I love it.
And, you know, so that's kind of my point on that is it's not an either or proposition. School can deal with that issue in a constructive manner, or it can use it to enforce a compliance model. And that's what we have seen in the British system. That's what gets carried over to the American system. And that I think we could do a lot more with to improve that situation.
It's
in
interesting
lots of ways, you know.
There was a point in history where this problem was being looked at. I found this interesting quotation from Nietzsche, of all people, 205, 206. Interesting in several ways. So, yeah, he's talking about something called resentiment, which is resentment, but he's got two S's in it. And Nietzsche says, this plant thrives best among anarchists and anti-Semites today. This is Nietzsche criticizing anti-Semitism. So much for what his sister did in rewriting his work and giving it to Hitler. But so it flowers like it has always done, in secret, like a violet, but with a different scent. And just as like always gives rise to like, it will come as no surprise to find attempts coming once more from these circles, as so often before, to sanctify revenge with the term justice.
There you go.
As though justice were fundamentally simply a further development of the feeling of having been wronged, and belatedly to legitimize with revenge emotional reactions in general, one and all. So, yeah, punishment, which word derives from the word pain, to inflict pain, rather than rehabilitation. In the early 1970s, there was a reform school in England called Pepper Harrow, single P, P-E-P-E-R. And a documentary was made about it at the time. And then about 20 years later, they came back, and 4 of the boys who had been in the documentary were interviewed in later life. And it is jaw-dropping. They had a 10% recidivism rate at Pepper Harrow. Only 10% of the kids who went through were reoffended.
10%? Not just 10, it wouldn't be 10% of that 4. It was just 10% of the total.
10% of kids going through the school.
And this was a school for already troubled teens, already troubled kids?
This was a school for children who had broken the law.
Right, okay. And so this was like a juvenile hall situation.
Yeah, very much so.
Wow, 10% is impressive. What did they do?
It's mind-boggling. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, through William Whitelaw, introduced a program that was called the Short, Sharp Shock, which is a quotation from The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan and means decapitation in the original version. But he thought it was funny that they would kind of boot camp kids. So they started this hard thing and they put it through all the reform schools. Their recidivism rate went up to 80%, which is about where it stands, I think, in the UK and America.
So do I get that right to interpret that as the more brutal they became with the kids, the more the kids would re-engage in criminality?
Yes.
Right.
And
that's pretty
of course,
cool.
prisons then become schools for scoundrels to learn all the tricks of the trade.
That's right.
One of the kids who'd gone to Pepper Harrow really stuck in my mind. He was 14 when he was there. I was kind of shocked watching the documentary because there are all these hippies, basically, who are the teachers and the jailers, whatever they're meant to be. One of the things that really shocked me was there was an 8-year-old kid walking around smoking a cigarette. Nobody stopped him. Now, for me, that's going a bit overboard with your liberal ideas, you know.
A little too progressive, I think.
But look at the consequences. The 14-year-old boy was the oldest of 4 children. All of his siblings were by different fathers. His mother had not managed to create a partnership, and she wasn't good at looking after the kids. So he'd started stealing food, and that's what he'd been caught doing. And he could not read and write. He's 14, and he can't read and write, and he's in this place. 20 years later, he has a PhD, and he's the head of child services for a whole county. Because what he saw there determined him.
What, in a nutshell, because I'm curious, what did they do? I mean, it wasn't just pure let them do whatever they want, clearly.
It was, they were constantly engaged in a social dialogue that they didn't have a large number of kids there. So they were talking with them all the time. They were finding out what their problems were, what they felt about the world, what they thought about the world, and allowing them to express that. I keep getting the name wrong, but I think it's Mendota. Spike will correct me. This is a juvenile facility in the US where they actually ran a proper study with a control group, and they pretty much were loving and friendly and brought counselors in for one group and left the others do what they did. There was something, I don't remember the numbers, but it was something like in the next 2 years, there were 16 murders committed by the control group and none.
Right. I think I read about that one.
Yeah. If you've read Opening Our Minds, I do actually mention it in there.
That must have been where I read about it then. Yeah, because I did read that. So yeah, that makes sense. Because that and it only makes sense. I hate to bring this in right now. I mean, I didn't know if I was where this would go, but I'll bring it up just because I'm always, I'm always thinking, I'm always looking at life lessons. And so we've got this new dog in our life, Benson, right? This little
Benson, not named after the dog in Time Bandits.
No, not after Time Bandits. No, but he is an adorable little Shih Tzu mix, right? And here's the thing. All my life, I've never had a pet that I would really call my own. Growing up with dogs, they weren't mine. I had to feed the dog, but it wasn't my dog. I didn't have a Lassie situation growing up. I was kind of arm's distance from our pets. I think I had a guinea pig or something. Point being, and I've never raised kids. I have a son, but I wasn't there to raise him. So this is the closest I've ever had. And I know parents kind of lose their mind when people compare pets with kids, because I know it's not the same thing. However, there are lessons, and there are lessons in patience, and there are lessons in behavior and behavior modification with animals and with kids. And you can learn those lessons and you can succeed with them, or you can continue to be frustrated and you can mistreat and abuse the pets or kids, and
Make it worse.
and you will make it worse, right? And one of those lessons is, and it's counterintuitive as hell. It runs against every bone in your body, especially at 3 a.m. when you've been woken up, right, by the screaming kid or the barking dog, right? And this is a rescue dog we've gotten. This is a 3-year-old rescue. This dog has been in an abusive situation. And we brought him into our home. And you recognize there's a responsibility there. You're the guy who brought him into the home. You're the one who had the kid. You asked for it. You had every opportunity to not have this, and now you got it. So you got to deal with it and be responsible for it. And there have been, like, the first night we had him was a sleepless night. Until we learned the language of my dog, right, my wife and I, we were at odds and we were very confused, and we would lose our patience and be very upset. But you learn. And we kept reading and reading and reading, like, okay, what do we got to do? What do we got to do, right? Because I don't want to make this worse. And the simple piece of information that I kept forefront the entire time was, this dog, there is no such thing as a dog that is going to try to get revenge on you or be spiteful to you. The dog is trying to do what he thinks you want him to do, or what he can't help but doing because of his biology. And I believe it's the exact same way with children. And that we assume the counterintuitiveness here is at 3 a.m. when you're being woken up, you take it personally. This dog is trying to disturb my sleep, trying to make me upset, trying to piss me off. And you have to realize,
this dog is a narcissist.
Exactly. This dog's a goddamn narcissist, right? Fuck this dog. And what you actually learn, though, right, by keeping these kind of simple ideas at the forefront, is that no, the dog is not being spiteful, not being vengeful, and is literally just trying to do what he thinks you want him to do. And you have to not give him opportunities to mess up. If you don't want him going in the bathroom, close the damn door. That's how you deal with it. You're the responsible person, right? And I guess I'm bringing this up because it's that counterintuitive thing. We immediately go to the wrong answer, actually. And once I started realizing that the dog came to us as a rescue with some attachment issues, with some he doesn't want to be left alone. And we were leaving him alone in the living room at night, right? Because we thought that's what he needed. And we were just wrong, right? And so we learned, oh, he's barking because he wants to be around us, not because he's trying to wake us up and make our life miserable. And again, it's counterintuitive, but once you acknowledge it and realize that you need to deal with this being, this little living organism, with tolerance, compassion, understanding, and learn its language, and I don't think a baby's any different, then you actually approach it from a completely different perspective. And now there's no more barking. Now there's no more problems, because we're talking to each other and we understand one another and the needs, right? And it took a couple weeks to get there. And there were some real, trials of patience in doing that. But keeping that at the forefront was really, really important. And it was a real life lesson for me. That I bring to this discussion here with the prisons and the reform schools and the various things is, it might not seem to the person who's always taking everything so goddamn personally that these solutions even exist. The kids just need to be beaten into compliance. Animals just need to be beaten into, doing what you want them to do. Well, the results you get from that are uniform, but they are uniformly awful for the well-being of the kid or the animal, right? You can beat them into submission. Turns out you can do it, but they resist you and fight you every step of the way, and they hate you for every single time you do it to them, because you're not understanding them.
Yeah, you're not actually in communication with them. When my all 4 of my children, as babies, stayed in bed with me and their mum till they were 6 months old. which I think is a really sensible thing to do, unless you're an alcoholic, in which case you might crush them. But they can feed from the breast without you having to get up, or But one morning, he was probably about 4 or 5 months old, my oldest boy, Ben. I was woken up. And what he'd managed to do is to get his head in his mother's neck, which gave him the purchase so he could kick me in the throat. And it was one of those moments. You're woken up painfully, and then you get that there is no intention. There is no motivation. He had a little smile. He was smiling. He thought he was having a good time. And it's true. I agree with you. It's true also of pets that I hadn't had a pet of my own until about 9 years ago. And a feral cat. I had a guy doing some work on the house, and he started feeding this cat. So the cat started coming around, and I'd be in the garden, and I'd put my hand out to stroke it, and it would scratch me. And this went on for a few weeks, and then gradually we got to know each other. And I became completely fascinated. It sadly developed a tumor in its throat. She developed a tumor in her throat, and that was the end of that.
Yeah.
But along the way, from her biting and scratching me, which was a fundamental part of her behavior, to take this wild or semi-wild animal and come into relationship with it, a relationship that's not based upon language, but that's based upon her understanding my intentions and me understanding her intentions. So the last, 7 or 8 months of her life, from about the July to February, she was perfectly placid with me. We had learned how to associate with each other, and it is a problem that people who hold on to some kind of puritanical view that human beings are evil unless they're constrained will commit horror in the world.
Yes.
And we are one of the first generations to even think that way.
That's right.
Spare the rod and spoil the child. As I say, when I went to school, it was still permissible for the teachers to hit us. So how on earth is that going to help? But there are people who believe it does. So
that's exactly.
Anyway,
but I really wanted to highlight that counterintuitiveness of it because we have a thought and then think, well, we had it, so it must be right. And it's like, no, man, that's not true. It's just, and there's also, of course, unfortunately, the generational aspect of it of, well, I was beaten as a kid and I turned out okay. And you're kind of like, I think we want to have a higher standard here, like it's okay for us to maybe not repeat all the mistakes that were, foisted off on us and call it good parenting, And I guess in a way this relates back, or I will relate it back to, this narcissism point that we're started talking about all this on before we started solving all the problems of the world. As we do. Because if anything, when I put this into a narcissistic frame of mind, I start thinking about a person who would look at the things we're talking about or look at the situations, be in the situations we're talking about, and it wouldn't even occur to them that the dog or the crete or the baby or whatever, that other people in their vicinity, the way I see it or think about it is that this is a person who the last thing that they're ever going to think about or take into consideration is the thoughts and feelings of other things around them.
Yeah, they're solipsistic. They might extend into their own family. They might extend into some of their friends. And I think sometimes you get characters who are narcissistic about their nation, that imagined community or their religious cohort, whatever they believe in, that they'll extend their good feeling to there, but they will be utterly destructive towards others. I keep talking about The Dawn of Everything by Wengrow and Graeber because it really blew my mind. It was just an incredible read. But one of the things they point to is that the origins of the Enlightenment in Europe may well have been an Algonquian native, an indigenous Algonquian called Kondiaronk. And it would appear that Rousseau kick-started the Enlightenment by taking ideas from this man. And he is referenced, there's no, but they had a particular problem with Europeans when they went over there. So we're talking about the early 18th century. And the Algonquian people have not been defeated. I found out today, they were defeated in St. Philip's War in 1765 and 66, which was by per capita the most destructive war that white people have fought.
Wow.
Because 10% of the population of New England died during this 1 year period.
Yeah.
But they flattened the Algonquian people, Mohicans, all of that lot. But Kondiaronk pointed out that what worried them about the Europeans was that they hated each other. They acted so badly towards each other. In their community, you were friendly towards all other Algonquian people. Now, you could be viciously nasty to anybody else, but they didn't understand the social dynamic of Europeans. And we see all of these tribal groupings now, the idea of the Aryan nations that Hitler would have accepted, people who are descended from Hungarians, Russians, Poles, as being Aryan. No, just having pale skin, I'm afraid, doesn't help you with that. But they get into this sense of belonging. And I think your leader-follower thing, part of that is there are some of us who are determined to think for ourselves.
I agree.
We are very small in number.
Yes. In fact, I think that I tend to think of it more as on that seat triad, but I do believe that there is this empath side of the spectrum, which is sort of its own kind of mutation, if you will. It's its own sort, because it's a minority thing, as I understand it. The true empaths, you and me, right?
2%, again, like sociopaths, psychopaths, yeah.
Yeah, and you have an opposite for every action. There's the opposite reaction, right? So you're going to have this, and even I know this is all invented. These are just ideas I have, but I even kind of justify it to myself evolutionarily, from an evolutionary biology point of view. If in a species that is at the top of the food chain and is commanding the world, and we kind of are, it would make sense to me, and it would make sense in other species as well. I don't think that this is uniquely a human thing, but I believe the level of complexity of human thought makes this a more complicated issue at the human level than, say, at the whale level or at the baboon level. But I still believe you're going to see shades of this at any biological level. Is you have to have a certain part of the species that takes out other parts of the same species, that preys on itself. Because how do you keep the population down when you're at the top of the food chain, right? But whether that's the purpose or not of serial killers, from an evolutionary biology point of view, I do see opposite sides of the coin. I see us as the opposite sides of the coin to that Ted Bundy, L. Ron Hubbard type personality or function, and I and you kind of think that maybe we're a smaller percent as they are a smaller percent. I don't know. That's where I start losing the plot, is I don't know what the percentages break down on this,
I think, realistically, my life's work from my teens has been to determine if it is rational to be nice to people.
Right.
And I have come to the absolute conclusion that being nasty to people isn't going to work. It's going to give us war, famine, disease, and death. It's not going to create a good human society. I think if we do manage to survive our massively suicidal tendencies as a species, that we may grow up. And that grown-up humans could be really a quite marvelous thing. We're a long way away from that now.
Actually,
understanding, but
yeah.
Still, it and part of the reason that it is so difficult is because predatory people, whatever we call them, rise to the top.
That's right.
trying to think of politicians who've been decent. It's hard. There are very few who, when we poke into their private lives and look at the way they behave towards people, there are an awful lot of philanderers, sexual predators who become serious. Clinton is a fairly obvious example. FDR, JFK, all Democrats as well. Notice that.
Well,
nobody would sleep with Nixon.
They throw Trump out there. I mean, talk about a sexual predator.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, he just grabs them by the pussy. I'd forgotten about him.
Oh, yeah.
But we have the same with Lloyd George, one of our greatest prime ministers, who had his mistress.
That's right. Even Bush was a philanderer and sort of serial sexual escapades kind of guy, as I understand it, back when he was sowing his wild oats before, politics became his thing.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of layers to that, of course, too, right? But it is interesting, and I think absolutely accurate, that the top tier of society, in terms of the leadership level, is dominated by these so-called narcissist, sociopathic personalities, whatever, predatory personalities, because to seek out power requires a mindset of being willing to and able to do bad things to people, because the societies that we have erected, that we structure, sort of are built around that. And it's just kind of the way our businesses are put together, right? It is
make money, make more money.
Yeah, I mean, we really structure ourselves in kind of awful ways, and we have developed systems that limit those atrocities or limit those proclivities. And we have pretty decent systems that accomplish that when you really think about the scope and magnitude of the problem. And the idea that, these systems, because they have flaws and errors and issues with them, well, let's tear them all down and hit the reset button. Hey, we already know what happens every single time we do that in history. We do not need to do that. Right? Because the new system,
you get the reign of terror.
Yes, it always happens, right? The thing that keeps the checks and balances in place and keeps the sociopaths in place is our systems, not lack of our systems or having to reset the system. It's building and reinforcing the system. And I it's just the short-sightedness of us that we miss that bigger picture, I think. And this kind of, in a way, our own short-sighted nature sort of is its own mechanism for perpetuating the narcissist.
Yeah, short-termism.
Yeah, we keep putting them there, and we keep not learning the lesson from the last guy. And it's not the system that's at fault; it's us. And we can do something about that, But we really do need to raise awareness and understanding about this, and realize that, we can do better, as you say.
And it is happening that looking at the corporate world in the last 20 or 30 years, tremendous changes have happened in some of the larger corporations, in many businesses, either because they want to be perceived as being good, because that's good for PR. And I don't mind that. I started working with that thought in the 80s, that if you're going to get politicians to do something good, the incentive is, they change society. We have this bizarre situation. I think Tony Blair is one of the worst human beings who ever lived. I think he was, we call him Tony B. Liar. He made $25 million in the year after he resigned as prime minister, and he's a socialist. So what? He didn't give any of it away. And you've got this bizarre thing that he is one of the causal factors of the Iraq war, where 750,000 people died.
Yep.
He's also the goodwill ambassador to the Middle East, which shows how sensible British politics is at heart. But
I can only agree with you, because it's not like our side of the pond is getting it a whole lot better in so many ways.
Well, what did happen that was good under Blair and Brown was that they brought in all sorts of environmental rulings, so that we actually pushed ahead of the Germans in terms of our eco-friendliness. Now, that's been the Tory administration since Cameron, Theresa May, and Boris Johnson have really not picked up the ball and done the right things.
Mm.
But I do sense that there is a growing will in the world, and that you know, we have to have hope. We have to see that by doing things better and taking responsibility, by growing up, by being mature, by not being pseudo selves, by being ourselves, by accepting our own tastes and preferences, accepting our own decisions, even as Joseph Campbell says, rejoicing in our vices, as long as they're not damaging to other human beings.
Right.
You know?
That's right. And not stigmatizing people because of these kind of disagreements or problems. We make issues out of non-issues 24/7.
Yeah.
Right. And
it's
that
like
in society, right? We do that. We all contribute to this nonsense.
Yeah, one of the most amazing things I've seen in the last year was a little bit of film of, yeah, I can't remember, it was maybe Black Lives Matter or Antifa on one side, and the KKK or who, but they're a line of people and they've got megaphones and they're like a few feet away from each other and they're yelling at each other obscenities.
Yep.
And I'm kind of going, this fervor is not helpful. We've got to come to dialogue. We've got to come to shared ground somehow. And whatever the contrails are doing, and whether vaccinations are actually will mean that I'll die 2 years ago when I had it. We have to bring evidence and rationality in at some point. That'd probably be useful.
Right.
We've probably worn down our audience now to fragments.
Well, I think, obviously, with the way we go, and these are how we talk, by the way, guys. This is when we were having talk.
Normal conversation.
Yeah, this is just us chatting. I always enjoyed having these conversations because they are always so far reaching. And because I get to bring in, and this is what I love about talking with you is I really get to bring in the full breadth of like all the things that are on my mind and that are recent and in the past.
Likewise,
and we get to actually dialogue on this stuff. And isn't it interesting how when we, that we do have this meeting of the minds on so many issues and things that we agree on, even though there are truly so many things you and I disagree on too. But we really meet on all these important things, and we can see that that the things that we don't agree on are really not as important. We don't harp on those because these are basic fundamental things that we think will really make a difference in society. And I agree with you that the biggest thing at the bottom of all of this is the hope factor. Is the fact that we can move this ball down the road and we can make things better. Just by talking about them and maybe pointing things out to folks, and maybe they'll think about them and they'll talk to some people about it, and that's the only way that change happens. It really doesn't. It's so rarely, if you really think about your life, how many changes in society or culture have come from the top down. Because the president ordered it. Really? When was the last time the prime minister really made a difference in your personal life, right? Because of some commandment or order. I mean, other than the masks thing, I'll give everybody that. But that was in response to a literally global pandemic. There's not one person.
And it took them a year at the World Health Organization to admit that it was transmitted aerially. And so all of this stuff about us washing our hands every 10 minutes.
Exactly.
And that, my dentist locally, he just put in units that would filter the air. Cost him a fortune, but he'd worked out that's what he needed to do. And that our schools, our public buildings need to have better airflow. And for all of the viruses and bacterial infections that are floating around out there. Yeah, we can. I've started to think, I'm just going to put this one last thought in because it's something that's very much been on my mind for the last month or so. I got this idea, we'll talk about human predators. Let's not bother with all of the minor versions of them. If somebody is predatory, we need to be aware of that.
Yep.
And we need to isolate them so they can't hurt us. And if we can, we need to rehabilitate them. And if we can't rehabilitate them, we need to lock them up. And that's that. Maybe we need to sometimes lock them up while we're rehabilitating them.
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen that there's another way of looking at this problem. And this has come from reading about the Black Lives Matter movement and looking at film of what's happening and some of the statements that are being made, some of the hateful statements that are being made. And I no longer care which side. I tend to say to people, I'm not on any side. I don't take a side. I want to resolve and bring people together if I possibly can. And I'm starting to wonder if we shouldn't use the term hate monger for people who infiltrate perfectly good, decent movements that are meaningful. If you look at Christianity, it started out with such hope, with such meaning, and it's been used to perform genocide.
Yes.
It's been used to burn witches, which is largely just old ladies who don't look the way they're meant to look. It's been used for concentration camps. It's been used, and this is hatred and the fervor of hatred. Yeah. And I think we be good to recognize that these people we're calling narcissists, they're only dangerous if they are spreading hate, if they are spreading divisiveness and opposition. So on that glad note.
I agree completely. I will add to that by saying that I have referred to such people as opportunists. Right? Because they tend to ride the coattails of the narcissist, right? We see all the enablers of Trump, et cetera, the Roger Stones of the world. I'll name some names, right?
Steve Bannon, Alexander Dugin, and I'm very sorry about his daughter, but what an evil human being.
Exactly. So we have two kinds of people we're talking about here, which is your predators, right? The guys who are really leading the charge. And you have these enablers, these hate mongers, these people, these agent provocateurs, these people who come in and stir things up because in that stirring is opportunity for them, or at least that's what they think in the moment. And it's amazing to me, and maybe this is a whole nother podcast, I'm not sure, certainly another topic, but it is endlessly amazing to me that such personalities seem to be utterly incapable of understanding the precariousness of their position. They always think they're going to be the exception to the rule, that the predator isn't going to prey on them or kick them under the bus the second they are no longer convenient or a useful tool for them. And they are.
Look where Steve Bannon is now.
Right, exactly. Look at where Roger Stone is now. Look at the laundry list of felons, convicted felons in Trump's orbit. Everybody who ever connects with this guy. Look at the orbit of L. Ron Hubbard. Look at the orbit of a Jim Jones. I mean, a David Koresh. There is nothing but disaster in the wake of a predator. No. They are the great white sharks of the human race. They just roam idly and munch on whatever they want to. And if those remoras, those little, those little fish that glom onto the sharks, they get eaten too sometimes in the feeding frenzy, and they never seem to twig on the precariousness of their position. So just my last little frustration.
So if there are any fish out there watching this, be careful, sharks.
Right? Don't be a fish, man.
I am a fish. What can I do about it? Where's Nemo?
Yeah, exactly. All right, John. Well, I definitely enjoyed talking. Thank you for.
Yeah, it's such fun. I think, we always have fun. And this may be the most fun we've ever had together. So let's keep on doing it. And thank you so much for, I know you're recuperating and here you are having this intense conversation. So thank you for engaging. And thanks to everybody for watching. If you're not actually subscribed, you should do that. But much more interested in your money, really. If you're not paying for this, then you're a cheapskate. What can I say?
Support the channel.
Yeah, get onto Patreon. Understand that Jack Conte gave the world one of the greatest gifts with his brilliant Patreon system. And go and watch Pomplamoose, his band, which is why he developed Patreon. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So thanks very much, Chris, and we will meet again soon.
Absolutely.